What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends podcast, available to you just about everywhere. And John's done such a great job, along with Scott Phillips, in making certain that we are available to you on TuneIn Radio, on Google Play, on Apple Podcasts, and on your microwave oven, John. That was really good. How did you get us on my microwave?
That was a little tough, but we're working on that.
I hit the popcorn setting, and we come up. It's amazing. Well, we welcome you back because we are going to take a little trip today. And I'll tell you, John, I had a wonderful perch years ago, sitting as I was in front of the southernmost motel. Well, actually, it's a hotel, but I'll call it a motel so people think I really have no money at all. But okay. I'll tell you, the southernmost hotel is where? Where would you think that is if you're talking about the southernmost hotel in the United States?
I think you're down at the Keys.
Yeah, I'm down in Key West. And I want us all to be sweating and feeling that we're in the Keys. I love that. And I love the Keys, and I love when people do a series like Body Heat, a movie, or Bloodline on Netflix, which was done in Key Largo, and you could feel the sweat pouring off you. So today, you better dress down because we are taking you for a trip. And we're going to be going 90 miles south of the southernmost hotel. And we're looking at a political transition that has a lot of implications for a segment of the American population that traces its roots to the island of Cuba.
Cuba, cigars.
Well, have you always found Cuba to be a fascinating place?
I've never had the need to go there. I mean, it's been a communist country. I do find it amazing, though, that the old cars that they keep fixing up and I drive around as taxi cabs and stuff. But, you got to wonder about the Castro crew and what they're up to.
Now, wait a minute. Are you thinking about the people who made the Castro convertible, or are you talking about the political Castros? Now, let's be honest. These Castros who threw Batista out and the Americans who controlled Batista back in the late 1950s, and they brought along that revolution, and they have been in power, John, ever since, 1959?
For a long time, as long as I can remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's be honest. I mean, they vexed the entire administration of John F. Kennedy.
Yep. Well, we had the Bay of Pigs, and then we had the missile crisis.
Exactly. So let's be honest. It punctuated the entire short Kennedy administration. And we've thought about it so much. It's amazing that a small country like this, a little island off of our coast, could have such an inexorable link to our own history in the recent period. Well, and you think about it, John, it's not only those crises, but humanitarian crisis affecting our relationship, a lot of those boat lifts and some very public cases related to it. And then, of course, it really affects the politics in a very important state here in the United States, that being Florida.
Florida has a lot of Cubans, yes.
And a lot of controversy, and they're different than many other Latinos in terms of the way they look at the world. And, of course, Marco Rubio has those roots, and we hear a lot about him, and maybe, again, he'll be a presidential candidate. We don't know. But there are many complications, complexities, nuances to this story that we rarely talk about here in the United States. And, of course, their relationship with our old adversary made our relationship with them so tenuous, that being, of course, the Soviet Union.
Right.
But all that's gone. They're not party to what's going on in the Soviet Union or Russia any longer, but they've got a new, well, should I say they're a client state of a new power. In a way, China. And we learned that in the course of our podcast in just a couple of moments. We are so blessed, John, that Roseann Lake, and you recall that Roseann is an incredible journalist. She was with us to talk about young women who are leftovers
Right.
in China.
Yep.
And she had incredible insights into that culture. Well, lo and behold,
She's
she
covering
arrives
Cuba.
in Cuba, and she is the correspondent for the Economist magazine, one of the most respected publications in all of the world. And she has an amazing grasp on the realities on the ground in Cuba and its relationships with America. We are so lucky to have her at this critical moment when the Castros have, well, left the scene to some extent.
Sort of.
Not totally. We'll talk about Raul and his current relationship to the new leadership and what his role will be going forward. But you've got to hear this particular podcast on America Trends. On the line with us is Roseann Lake, and she is a reporter for The Economist and, of course, one of the most respected publications in the world covering Cuba. And that's a great beat to have these days, isn't it, Roseann?
Cuba, I don't know. This is a very well-kept secret, but I think it's the best beat that one can have. It's a fascinating place, and not too much has changed since I've been covering the beat, which is, part of the fascination. You have to dig a little bit deeper to sort of read through what's going on, but it's an exciting time. Cuba, as you know, has a new president, which I don't think will yield tremendous change in the very near future, but still, it's a sign that, change will come eventually.
Well, it's the first time that a Castro has not been leading the country since the revolution in 1959. So is that a change without a difference, or how distinctive a change might that be going forward?
It's not a Castro, which is true. And I think a lot of people sort of leading up to the transition were saying, is there going to be a last-minute change? Is Raul going to put in his daughter or, someone else with a Castro name? He didn't. He stayed on script, and he really did put in Miguel Diaz-Canel, he had been grooming for a very long time to sort of take this role. And I think, Diaz-Canel was, I guess, a wise choice on Raul's part and on the government's part, because he's going to continue the role of being a consensus builder. When Diaz-Canel took to the dais to sort of give his first speech as president, he was very deferential to Raul Castro and really reinforced the idea that, Raul was still going to be in command, and he is actually still head of the Communist Party and head of the armed forces, so technically he is still in command, and that, things were going to continue as they were. So, a lot of the tweets that were being put out by some of the state-run agencies were telling. Somos continuidad was one of the hashtags that we were seeing a lot. It was, we are continuity, and por Cuba, for Cuba. The dialogue was very much one of, we're going to continue what has been going on. And I think, Diaz-Canel has no choice but to accept that, accept this narrative, right? I am going to continue, and I think he's been groomed and vetted as a person who will be a good one to sort of, keep up the mandate of what Raul Castro, not so much Fidel Castro, because they are different, what Raul started to do, but he will have the delicate job of, of mediating between the post-revolutionary generation, which he is a part of, and the Fidelistas, right? The older crowd, the people in their 80s and 90s that are still kicking around in government.
And I do want to talk about that. But Raul, he's going to remain the first secretary of the Communist Party and described by the Cuban Constitution as the country's highest guiding force, whatever that means. And then he's got a 52-year-old son, Alejandro, Raul Castro's son, who is very powerful. He is within the Interior Ministry, and he had something to do with the opening to the United States under the administration of Barack Obama. Is there any chance that a young Castro or younger Castro, now you mentioned the daughter, but might want to assume those responsibilities, and that could create a power struggle, no?
That's a very interesting idea and a wonderful thought for a television series or a movie. Mariela takes it back, or Alejandro takes it back. But I don't see it happening. I think, had they wanted it, they probably would have. I don't know that they would have been given the option, but Raul is known as being a family man, and I think Mariela is very visible. Well, they're both very visible in politics. Mariela, there was a time where it was rumored that she would take over, but personally, knowing people who know her well, it just doesn't seem like her cup of tea. So I don't think it's something that she would do. I mean, she's head of Senesex. So Cuba, basically the Senesex, how to translate. It's a very long acronym, and I'm not going to translate it articulately off the top of my tongue, but basically she's one of Cuba's premier activists for all things LGBT. LGBTQ, right? So she's very progressive, and but that's really that's her sweet spot. I don't see her wanting to sort of branch out and take on the very large responsibility of dealing with the country. And in fact, she almost seems too progressive to want to have to deal with that old guard, because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of pressure, having to sort of move at that glacial pace of, dealing with these. I don't envy Miguel Diaz-Canel right now. I mean, he's going to deal with a country that is in a rut economically, and they're going to eventually have to unify currencies. This is something they've been talking about in earnest for a very long time. I was actually surprised and somewhat disappointed that it's not something that Raul Castro managed to do before he left. But, as Cuba adjusts to having one currency, which is the plan, and what it needs to do to sort of bring its economy back to, a sort of a clean slate by which you can actually measure real productive economic growth, that's going to cause a whole lot of inflation and distress, and people are going to be, discontented by it. And so the person at the helm of that has to be strong and deal with a whole lot of, blowback and criticism, and it's not going to be an easy role. So,
well, you talk about a couple of things that we might be assuming our listeners understand better than they do. One is about the two currencies, but I want to go back first to the difference between Fidel Castro and his revolutionary role, and that continued seemingly, at least in garb and approach and tenor and oratory, and then Raul Castro. Why don't we go back to that and then help us to understand the economics of two currencies. But start with the transformation from Fidel to Raul.
Sure. I mean, this is something that often gets lost because, Raul is also a Castro, and people just assume that he was an appendage of Fidel's, but that's really not true. Raul was much more reform-minded than Fidel, and as someone who spent a lot of time in China, I actually wanted to think of him as a Deng Xiaoping type character, right? As someone who took power after a very charismatic leader, right? Deng inherits power after Mao Zedong, who is, somewhat fanatical and very charismatic in many ways, just like Fidel.
Yeah, that's an interesting analog, yes.
Yeah, and he's, Raul, like Deng Xiaoping, is much more soft-spoken. He, doesn't command an audience in the same way that his predecessor did. But he did make some very important changes. So, one big contribution that he made, a very lasting one that has contributed a lot to sort of where Cuba is today, is he changed immigration laws. Which basically allowed Cubans to leave Cuba and return once every 2 years while still retaining property and social benefits. And he also made it possible for them to leave without an exit permit. So basically it made it much easier for Cubans to get out of Cuba, to work abroad, to get skills abroad, and most importantly, to send money back. So a lot of that private sector that we're seeing taking off, which is, the motor of the Cuban economy. And it's going to play a very important role going forward, especially as currencies are unified, and I'll get more into that later. But, that was an important part. You saw more talent coming in and more money coming in, and you see a sort of circular migration because these people, some of them left and stayed abroad and don't want anything to do with Cuba, but many of them did come back, and they're bringing talent and capital to Cuba. And a lot of those restaurants and a lot of those businesses that we see, of the few that are permissible under the private sector laws, that's foreign capital. You don't make that kind of money in Cuba, right? This is foreign money. So that was very important. That was a way of sort of jump-starting the economy. And that was all thanks to, Raul making this change. And it did play out in significant ways. Also, under his command, the private sector, which in 2008, when he took power, it employed 150,000 people. Today, it employs almost 600,000. And, that's a big part. You can't say that he opened the floodgates and embraced a capitalist model. That couldn't be further from the truth. But he was certainly more progressive from an economic perspective than his brother was, and that did make a difference. He was also more open to reestablishing diplomatic relations with the United States. I mean, we did see at the Summit of the Americas last week in Peru, there was tension between Cuba and the United States. Raul Castro didn't go, Donald Trump didn't go, and instead, you had Mike Pence and you had the Cuban foreign minister Bruno Rodriguez go, and they did not meet one another, and the U.S. did not meet with Cuban officials. They just met with civil society, which Cuba doesn't like. But, it was mentioned, I believe it was in sort of Raul's farewell speech, that he did, want to he did list, restoring diplomatic relations as one of his achievements and as something that, will continue. Probably not as with this much vigor as it did under Obama, but it's there. So he is different.
What kind of opening is there between the U.S. and Cuba? I mean, despite some of these setbacks during the Trump administration, some of these may be temporary. I mean, what is the movement in the relationship between the United States and Cuba, and how is it being manifested? More tourism, more American dollars? What kind of influence does America have now? Is there more American investment in Cuba? Explain what the extent of the change really has manifested into.
Well, initially there was the prospect of more American investment, and there was a spike in tourism. There were definitely a lot of people taking advantage of Airbnb, and definitely more American tourists than the island had ever seen. That's been somewhat complicated, following an announcement that President Trump made in June in Miami, and that took effect in the early fall. And it basically just means that travel to the U.S. for American citizens is just slightly more convoluted. Before, a very popular category to tick off when you're applying for a visa was the people-to-people category. And if you check that off, you could travel under Obama, you could travel to Cuba on your own terms. You didn't have to stay, you didn't have to travel with a tour group and stay in hotels and eat meals that had been prearranged. And that's what people like to do, because I think over 60% of American tourists to Cuba were millennials. And, they favor the more sort of backpacking approach, staying in Airbnbs and moving around the island. And so the new regulations made that more complicated. Now, if you tick the people-to-people box, you need to travel in a pre-vetted tour. And that essentially means that, it's to ensure that you're not staying in any enterprises in Cuba that have any sort of affiliation with the military. So Gaesa is the arm of the military that runs a lot of the tourism industry in Cuba. So it operates hotels and rent-a-car and some marinas. So under the new regulations, diving with dolphins could technically get you in trouble. That could be a crime from a U.S. standpoint, because the marina in which the dolphins are swimming is controlled by the military, right? So, it gets absurd to the point where there's a certain brand of cola, Cuban cola, that you can drink, and there's another brand of cola that you cannot drink because of some sort of obscure link to the military. And it's kind of like, but surely these colas are being transported on roads that were paved in some way from money that the military. I mean, you can't weed out the military. It's one of the few parts of Cuba that actually has money, and so anything tourism related, anything that's somewhat of a luxury is going to be controlled by them. But anyway,
well, for those of us who might have thought that by now, given American entrepreneurship and the fact that Cuba used to be our little playground until the Castros came in, that we were going to get back to that, and the Marriotts and the Hiltons were all going to be built, and the beaches would now resemble something closer to Bermuda. I mean, how far off are we in terms of that vision?
I'm sorry, it's going to look like China. We've missed the boat. And right now what you're seeing are, Chinese companies that are looking to invest there, golf courses, hotels. They were waiting cautiously to see what the U.S. would do from a diplomatic perspective. And I think they've received a pretty clear sign that it's not looking good. There is a Marriott hotel that it was a deal that was signed before the regulations changed, and so it was grandfathered. But we're not going to see much traction from American enterprises because it's complicated for them to go in. I mean, it's the new regulations have made it harder, and with other destinations in the Caribbean where you could do similar projects, I guess it's also there's not that much of an economic need. It's like, okay, well, if I can just do this in Puerto Rico with less of a headache, why not do that? Why go through all the trouble and do it in Cuba, which is unfortunate because you really do have some incredible shorelines and everything else, but China is looking into that. I mean, that is something that they're doing. The last time I was there, someone spoke to me about this agreement that they were trying to broker between the Chinese Ministry of Tourism, I believe, and the Cuban one. And essentially it was to get a red route, what they were calling a red route, certified in Cuba. So basically a tourism route that you could send Chinese tourists on that sort of extolled the virtues of communism. So you'd have, a stop in Santiago de Cuba where Fidel is buried, and it's considered, a cradle of the revolution. And you would have Chinese tourists, sort of complete this route. And I think the idea was maybe to either have a portion of their trip subsidized or some sort of an incentive for them to complete this trip while also, discovering Cuba. And on the Cuban side, my sense was this was something they were keen to do because tourism is an industry that they're keen to develop. And this is something that, they wanted to become certified. They wanted to have this red route. They wanted to work with the Chinese government to be able to do that. And by extension, maybe lock in a deal to have direct flights from China to Cuba, which would be very telling. Right?
Well, why am I hearkening back to the days when Russian products filled the stores and Russian cartoons played on Cuban television, and we were very concerned and we had a lot of conflict, and now you're saying that another competitor of ours, a different type of communist state, is right near us, right below us in the south flank, and they are beginning to take a toehold. How different is this from that Russian era?
It's different in the sense that Cuba has a bit more economic autonomy than it did in the Russian era, right? They were really being held up by the Soviet Union. Cuba wasn't producing anything, and they were just living off of generous subsidies from Russia. And believe me, the remnants of that remain. There's a lot of Soviet plumbing, a lot of Soviet construction, and most importantly, the Ladas, the cars, the Russian cars from the 1970s that are considered new in Cuba because they are much newer than the American, the Bel Airs from the 50s. And then, of course, the newest cars are the Geelys from China, which are being shipped. Every time I land in Jose Marti Airport, I see fewer and fewer, old, colorful American cars and more yellow Chinese taxis. And I understand that for Cubans, that's an improvement because they have air conditioning and they don't break down and everything else. But it does make me sad to not see as many because I enjoy seeing them and I enjoy riding them even more than seeing them. But, Cuba's more, it's not living off charity in China like it was, during in the 70s, 80s, and the early 90s, like it was in Russia. So there's a difference there. I mean, it has more of a foot to stand on. It also has more suitors, right? The European Union is very keen to do business in Cuba from a tourism perspective. There are a lot of Spanish hotel chains. There are also Canadian ones. It's a more international place now. So it's not that China would dominate quite as much, but China's coffers do dig a bit deeper than those of most other countries, and as a result, partially as a result of the embargo, Cuba's not eligible for international financing of any sort, and so it needs to depend on foreign direct investment, and China has that kind of money to put in, and it also it has the coffers to go deep enough to ensure that it can to allow it to wait a bit longer before turning a profit. So the Chinese are investing in renewable energy, and they're not investing nearly as heavily as they did in Venezuela, for example, possibly because they got burned in Venezuela, or possibly because they've come to the realization that, Cuba has very little money and China is not the Red Cross. They're not going to do this, for charitable reasons. They want to see a bottom line. So they're not going to be quite as dominant as the Soviet Union.
Does China see any opening here in the Americas? Because of course we used to use Puerto Rico as a hedge against what communism demonstrated in Cuba. We wanted to show that the capitalist model really could work in Puerto Rico. And lately, because of the concern about the way the mainland has looked at Puerto Rico, does China see an opportunity in the Caribbean to make more investment and more sphere of influence than they might have otherwise, given the concerns about America even and its ties to Puerto Rico?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I'd have to look more closely at the numbers, but if you look at, kind of how China is investing, it's sort of surrounding the southern part of the United States. Mexico is a big, upcoming target. It's really it's laying its pieces quite strategically around the southern part of the United States just to sort of ensure it's there. I mean, I'm sure there are, investment opportunities that it's keen to follow, but also from just a power perspective. Having that presence in those places is, I think, important to China, and they are making a conscious effort to do that.
Interesting. We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us. Yeah. Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that dispels that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter. That's right, where the world turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well, you can direct message us at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And you know, John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends. How much do we have to understand? And I'm going to get back to the two currencies, Roseann Lake from The Economist, talking about Cuba and its future and future relations with America. How much do we have to understand about the special period when the Russians took off, and the lost generation, those who were not part of the revolution and didn't have a lot of say during that revolutionary period? Do we have to understand those two things to understand where we're going in Cuba?
Well, yes. I mean, I think bringing up the special period is an important reference point when we think about where Cuba's economy is now. On paper, things look really, really dismal. And it always shocks me that, I tend to read up on a lot of the numbers before I go, and then I spend time there and I see things moving and I see things progressing. And I say this to, economists whose work I rely on all the time. It's, your numbers are not corresponding with reality. And they say, we know. We get the same sense too. We go to the supermarkets and we see there's toilet paper, there's food in them, and we don't know where it's coming from. I mean, if you look on, on paper, this is not the story that it's telling. But I think what's important to keep in mind, for a while, I was really worried about food security in Cuba. I was looking at, how little Cuba produces, and I was looking at how much money it was no longer getting from Venezuela. And I was worried about, remittances being cut off. And I'm thinking, how are people going to eat? How is Cuba, if Cuba's main sources of foreign currency, namely, the oil that it gets from Venezuela and then resells to the rest of many other countries in the world, if that supply is being cut off, what are they going to use to purchase food with? And I was very worried about this for a very long time. And, people kept reminding me, this is nothing compared to the special period, because Cuba's, economic portfolio, although it's far from being very brawny, is much sturdier than it was in the 90s during the special period, partially because, Raul helped those reforms, and there is a private sector, but it's not as bad. I mean, there is a private sector now, and these are people who I've been very inspired by, a lot of young Cubans who have spent time abroad and have wanted to go back. One, because they love their island, and two, because they want to see good changes there. And yes, they're frustrated by the system, and they wish the government didn't, freeze licenses for the private sector, because they have restaurants they want to open and they have things they want to do, but they want to go back nonetheless, because they really feel that their island has something special in its home, and they see the potential in it. And it's also remarkable, how many Americans are I don't have the exact numbers on this, but every time I go, I hear, from Cuban Americans who are reinstating themselves in Cuba. So they're getting I guess it's called what is it called in Spanish? The term is escaping me now, but they're basically, taking up residence in
So
Cuba.
a reverse migration from the United States.
A reverse migration. We're seeing that. So, these things are encouraging. The numbers that we just see, on a page don't tell the entire story, but it certainly won't be nearly as dire as it was in the 90s. Those were very, very hard times that I don't think Cuba will ever see.
Well, when the new president said that he wanted to continue allowing the limited growth of private enterprises like restaurants and taxis, but leaving important sectors like energy, mining, telecommunications, medical services, rum and cigar production in the hands of the state, do you think that any of those areas might ultimately be privatized?
Well, it depends. It depends how... we can answer the dual currency system.
Okay, let's get back to that in the context of this.
Yeah, so basically Cuba has a dual currency system. There's the Cuban peso and then there's the convertible peso. And one Cuban peso is equivalent to, so the exchange rate is basically 24-1 for the market. So if I were to change CUCs to Cuban peso, it would be 24-1. But in the state sector, that exchange rate changes. So sometimes it's 1-1, which essentially means that for accounting purposes, a business, a state-run enterprise, can look 24 times more profitable than it actually is. So basically this dual currency system, it's very convoluted, but the bottom line is it hides just how tremendously inefficient and unprofitable a lot of state-owned enterprises are. And so, once that system is unified, depending on how they do it, a few economists have talked to me about the different theories that are being considered. It's not clear which approach is going to be taken, but when that happens, it's clear that, no matter how subtly they try to do this, how much they try to alleviate a shock to the system, there's going to be one, and state-owned enterprises are going to suffer, right, because they've been hiding how unproductive they've been for a very long time. If that proves to be somewhat catastrophic and the need for foreign investment becomes more dire, I think the government will probably have no choice but to privatize a few more of these industries. And, when you mention renewable energy, it's something that remain state-owned, but there is a lot of foreign investment. There's Shanghai Electric is involved. They've put up a lot of money for renewable energy in Cuba, and basically it's a 49 to 51% kind of deal in most cases. I'm not sure if this is the case for Shanghai Electric, but in most cases, foreign investment, you own 49% of the company, and the state retains 51%. So they're still the major shareholder in this. If times become a bit more desperate, that will change, and more power will be shifted into foreign players. It's unlikely, but if economic circumstances require it, we could see it happen, and maybe with a bit more time, as this rhetoric of maintaining this continuity and this stability, as that sort of abates, as people phase out, as the older generation, passes on, maybe we will see that. But I don't think it will be immediate, although it's certainly something that, it's not improbable.
Tourism numbers have more than doubled since Raul Castro and Barack Obama had this opening, if you will. What about tourism? What role will it play in the coming period in terms of any rebirth of the economy in Cuba?
An important one. Tourism is tricky. It's brought a whole lot of wealth to Cuba, right? Because people who own Airbnbs or casas particulares, people who operate these, are, they're bringing in a fair amount of money. If you have a room to rent, in Havana or in a place that's on, the tourist map, you can earn a fair amount of money. Taxi drivers as well, depending on the city. You can earn a lot more than someone at a state-owned enterprise can earn. And while that's wonderful because it's money that's, being reinvested into maybe rehabilitating older properties because, you want more rooms to be able to rent out and everything else, it's also created some imbalances that the Cuban government is worried about, right? There are Cubans who, don't have access to an extra room that they can rent out, or the capital to be able to renovate one to make it rentable, or to a car that they can use as a taxi. And so by being sort of cut off from this private sector, they're working in the state-owned sector, and the salaries are not comparable. The latest number for the average salary in Cuba is about $30 US a month, and I know that a taxi driver can make that very easily in a day after he or she, usually he has covered most of his expenses and tolls and everything else. So, there is some inequality emerging between people who work in the private sector, namely tourism, because the private sector is essentially tourism, and people who work in the state-owned sector, because it's, the amount of money that you earn is completely different. And the government is worried about that. And part of the reason brakes were probably put on restaurants and taxis were for that reason. They, are very committed to maintaining the ideals of the revolution, and part of that means, equality. And they don't want to see people getting too wealthy. And, people who have gotten wealthy, because there is, you see signs of wealth in Havana, are usually quite savvy about hiding it, because they know it's not good to flaunt it. It will get in trouble, and it has gotten people in trouble.
Now that this generation, the lost generation, those who came after the revolutionary predecessors, is in place, and they are represented, of course, by the new president. We, of course, remember that one of the great innovations during the revolutionary period to maintain control was the fact that people were given a good education and health care was made accessible and of pretty good quality. I mean, is that something that really they need to hold on to in order to keep the affection of the people of Cuba? Because the new president said the people will participate in the decisions that this government takes. And I don't know that that's a change, but how important is health and education to the continuing sustenance of this government, or the style that came out of the revolution?
It's very important. It's important for the national rhetoric because those are the capstones of the revolution, but it's also important because this is what Cuba prides itself on. And it is problematic because, there are trips that I take down there, and you'll talk to taxi drivers who are, trained aeronautical engineers or what have you. Everyone is, they're educated people. They're not, taxi driver is something they do to make money. And they'll tell you, I'm not setting a good example for my children because they go to school and I have a hard time telling them that they need to study, because they see that, they see in me that, studying doesn't get you very far. I'm trained in something that I cannot practice. And I think it is eroding the values of the younger generation because they're not seeing work opportunities. And when you don't see that, when, you can hustle with a business, a restaurant, or, being a taxi driver, or copying, downloading videos, music videos and music and selling that on an external hard drive, when you can do that, when that's the best way to make ends meet, it doesn't really do much for your education system. And people have, flagged that to me as a concern. Parents, especially, have a hard time telling my kids to focus because they just don't see it. And that's problematic. And, it's also problematic because Cuba is facing some serious brain drain, right? There are people who leave and come back, but there are also people who leave and because of the skills, because of the education they've gotten, they're employable, especially under wet foot, dry foot, right? That policy that gave special immigration status to Cubans who arrived in the U.S. That no longer exists. So their top destination may no longer be the United States because it's more complicated to get here, but that doesn't count out, other countries in Latin America or Spain, which is also a popular destination. So there's this sort of brain drain, and that's problematic for the health system because Cuba is aging rapidly. I mean, a testament to the health system is that the longevity rates are incredible. The longevity, the average age of death is the same in Cuba as it is in the United States, or it may be actually a little bit older. That's unique in the Caribbean. They've really managed, healthcare is something that they've managed to do very well, but they're looking at an aging population and a dwindling younger population being able to support it from a medical standpoint, from a taxpayer standpoint, and from just a talent perspective. So these are two very serious issues. One, for the national rhetoric. This is something that Cuba prides itself on. It's known internationally for the quality of both of these things, which have gone down. I've spent time, in state-run pharmacies and seeing what they have when compared to what you'll see at a hotel pharmacy or a private pharmacy is very upsetting. Anything you want, you can find in a private one, whereas I think it's been quoted pretty often, pretty recently, that, a lot of hospitals are down 80% of the types of medicines that they need to treat. patients on a regular basis. It's a concern, right? Because medicines are, Cuba does produce some, and the ones that it produces well, but it can't produce for every possible disease. It does well for lung cancer and for diabetes. If you have one of those things, you're pretty okay in Cuba. For other things, you're in trouble. So this will be very problematic going forward, and it's part of the reason that I really hope Cuba gets its economy onto a healthier path. It opens up the private sector. It gives people more of a reason to stick around and to try to to stay and to, build up what is necessary for Cuba to sort of maintain those goals of the revolution, because they're respectable ones, ultimately. So,
Roseann, let me ask you in closing. The United States, we talked about a reset with Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. Is there any comparable reset? That reset didn't go terribly well. So
no.
tell us, is there
Thank you, Marco Rubio.
Is there a real reset in our relationship with Cuba?
There was. Now the reset has been reset. It's gone backwards. And what I'm hearing from the Miami crowd is that, no, I don't see it going incredibly well in the imminent future. I think we've lost an opportunity to extend a hand and reestablish a relationship with a country that, it's in our interest to at least be on cordial terms with. We've that it seems that ship has sailed, as much as it hurts me to admit that, because I would have loved to see more engagement. We were doing well for a while. Right now, it's not looking incredibly well from a high level, from a political perspective. What encourages me is the fact that Cuba is home to many migratory sharks who get a little too hot in the summer, and they swim up to New Jersey. The same is true of eagles and turtles and all sorts of other species. And we've not really backpedaled too much as far as scientific partnerships. So I'm going to be down doing a diving trip in Cuba in 2 weeks, working with a lot of marine biologists, and those things are still going. It's a bit more complicated for American scientists to get visas, and way more complicated for Cuban ones to come to the U.S. and continue those exchanges. But I'm not relying too much on politics to bring the two countries together at this point. I'm looking more at science and academic exchanges and entrepreneurial exchanges, entrepreneurs who, do programs here through Cuba Emprende and many of the programs set up through Washington to be able to train them. That's where I see hope, and that's where I see more of a relationship, continuing to forge ahead. But from a political perspective, I'm saddened to report I don't see that looking very good.
Another very interesting perspective from Roseann Lake. She had visited with us before, talking about the young people of China, and now we're focused on Cuba. And your knowledge and your interest and your journalistic skills know no bounds. Thank you so much for coming by today, again on America Trends.
Oh, you asked great questions. Thank you.